The rancher saved the wrong Apache woman. Now the Comanche beauty demands him too. Wild West. Thomas stood in the rain, his boots sinking into the wet earth as he tended to his cattle. He had lived alone for years, on this vast ranch, far from the bustling towns and busy people. His life was simple, and though it was often lonely, he preferred it that way. The constant wind, the distant mountains, and the quiet of the land were all he needed. He had long ago learned to depend on no one but himself. The storm had come out of nowhere. One minute the sky was clear, and the next, dark clouds had rolled in from the horizon, blotting out the sun. The wind picked up, pushing against him like a living thing, making it harder to keep the herd under control. Thomas had seen storms before, but this one felt different. More violent, more unpredictable. He was just about to head back to the cabin when he heard something, a sound faint but distinct over the roar of the storm. It was a low, pitiful cry. His heart skipped a beat. In this wild land, cries could mean many things. It could be an animal in trouble, or worse, a person. Thomas pushed through the downpour, following the sound. It led him to a small cluster of trees near the edge of his property. There, lying on the ground in the mud, was a woman. Her clothes were torn, and her skin was marked with cuts and bruises. Her face was dirty, and her dark hair was matted to her scalp. She looked like she had been through a battle, and in some ways, she had. Without thinking, Thomas knelt beside her and gently lifted her into his arms. She was light, but the weight of her pain seemed to press down on him, as if the storm itself had brought her to him for a reason. He could feel the heat of her fever through the thin fabric of her dress, and he knew she needed help. Quickly, Thomas hurried back to his cabin, cursing the wind as it whipped around him. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried the woman inside. She was unconscious, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Thomas moved quickly, starting a fire in the hearth and grabbing some blankets. He gently laid her on the bed, carefully covering her with the warmth of the blankets as he assessed her injuries. Her wounds weren't deep, but they were numerous. Cuts from branches, scratches from rocks, and bruises all over her arms and legs. Thomas worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging the worst of her injuries. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but he could tell she was in no condition to travel alone. As the night wore on, he sat beside her, watching over her. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was a strange quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of the woman's breathing. Thomas tried to make sense of the situation. But his breaking eye, what was a woman doing out here, in the middle of a storm, alone and injured? Who had done this to her? It was hours before the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she groaned softly, the pain evident on her face. Thomas stood up and moved closer, trying to reassure her. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." She blinked at him, her dark eyes wide with confusion. She tried to sit up, but Thomas gently pushed her back down. "Rest," he said. "You've been through a lot." The woman didn't speak for a long moment. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she were trying to make sense of where she was. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you?" "My name's Thomas," he replied. "I found you outside in the storm." "You were hurt?" She nodded slowly, as if the weight of his words was sinking in.
"Thank you," she whispered.
"I was running. From something?" Her voice trailed off, and she closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with fear. Thomas frowned. "You don't need to worry about that now. You're safe here. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she seemed lost in her thoughts, as if her mind was somewhere far away. Thomas watched her for a while, wondering who she was and where she had come from. Her features were unfamiliar to him, but there was something about her that felt different. She wasn't just some random traveler. There was a depth to her, a strength hidden beneath her fragile exterior. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time. "I'm Aita," she said, her words coming out slowly as if she had to force them from her lips. "I'm Apache." Thomas's eyebrows rose at her words. Apache. He had heard the stories, of course. The Apache were a proud and fierce people, known for their warriors and their independence. They didn't often venture into the more settled parts of the West. If she was Apache, then her situation was far more complicated than he had thought. "You're Apache?" Thomas asked, his voice a little more careful now. "What happened to you?" Aita looked away, her gaze shifting toward the window. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Thomas didn't press her. He could tell she wasn't ready to talk yet. "I was," she began, but her words faltered. "I was taken from my tribe. They attacked us, killed most of my people." Her voice broke on the last word, and she closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to block out the memory. "I was running from them. I don't know who they were. They didn't speak like us." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew how hard life could be in the West, but he had never known such a tragedy. The pain in Aita's voice was enough to make him want to protect her, to make sure no one else could hurt her. But he also knew that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. "Where are you going?" he asked quietly, not wanting to push her too much, but needing to know. "Do you have family?" Aita shook her head. "No family, no home," she said. "I was alone when I ran. I don't know where to go." Thomas felt a weight in his chest. He could sense that she didn't just need his help with her injuries. She needed more than that. She needed someone to help her find her way, to help her heal. But he also knew that getting involved with her, a woman from a tribe he didn't know well, could lead to trouble. The Apache were known for their warriors, and a man who helped an Apache woman might find himself in the middle of a conflict he wasn't ready for. Still, something in him told him that he couldn't turn her away. She had already suffered enough. "You can stay here for as long as you need," he said, his voice firm. "I'll help you." Aita met his gaze then, her eyes full of gratitude. But there was something else there, too, something deeper, something Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on, and that feeling would only grow stronger as the days went by. As the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas settled into the chair by the fire, knowing that his quiet, solitary life had just been interrupted in a way he could never have predicted. The days passed slowly for Thomas and Aita. The storm had cleared, but the cold still hung in the air, and Thomas knew it would take time for her to fully recover. Every morning, he would check on her, bringing her food, water, and fresh bandages. Slowly she regained strength, though her eyes often seemed distant, as if her mind was still far from the quiet cabin and the peaceful days she was now spending. Thomas had no experience in healing people, but he did what he could. He found herbs from his land, and with the help of old books his mother had left him, he learned how to treat her injuries. Aita rarely spoke during those early days, but Thomas noticed how her eyes would brighten when he would tell her about his own life, his cattle, his ranch, and his memories of growing up with his brothers and sisters before they all left to seek their fortunes in the bigger towns. In the evenings, after dinner, Aita would sit by the fire, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets Thomas had given her. Though she was healing physically, It was clear that the emotional wounds ran deeper. Ayeta had lost everything: the people she loved, her home, and her way of life. Thomas knew that words couldn't erase that kind of loss. All he could do was offer his kindness and his quiet presence. One evening, as the sun began to set and the cool night air crept into the cabin, Thomas noticed something unusual out of the corner of his eye. There was a figure standing by the tree line, watching him. It was a woman, tall and proud, with dark hair and piercing eyes that glinted in the fading light. She was dressed in clothes unlike anything Thomas had ever seen: beaded leather, furs, and a cloak that looked like it had been made from the finest materials. The woman stepped forward, her movements smooth and confident. She didn't speak at first, just approached with a sense of purpose. Thomas felt his heart quicken. There was something about her that made him feel both uneasy and curious. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice steady though his hand instinctively reached for the rifle propped up by the door. He didn't want to make any sudden moves, but he couldn't deny that he was ready for whatever might come next. The woman didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she gazed at him with a knowing look in her eyes, as if she had been expecting this moment. She was beautiful, her features sharp, her face proud and full of strength. "I am Naira," she said, her voice low but clear. "I am from the Comanche." Thomas frowned. He had heard of the Comanche before, a powerful tribe that ruled the plains. They were warriors, fierce and skilled in battle. He knew better than to underestimate them. "I'm Thomas," he said cautiously, still not lowering the rifle. "What brings you here?" Naira's gaze shifted to the cabin where Ayeta was sitting by the fire. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the woman. "I'm looking for my sister," Naira said quietly. "Ayeta." Thomas's stomach tightened at the mention of Ayeta's name. He had known this moment would come, though he had hoped it wouldn't be so soon. He glanced back at Ayeta, who had stood up from the fire and was watching Naira now, her face a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Naira stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Ayeta. "You've taken my sister," she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. Ayeta's eyes widened at the words, and she stepped forward to meet Naira halfway. There was something familiar in the way they looked at each other, a bond that ran deep, one Thomas could never understand. They spoke in a language that was foreign to him, their words quick and sharp. He could tell there was anger there, but also a deep unspoken understanding between the two women. Thomas felt like an outsider in that moment. He didn't know their history, didn't know what had happened to make them both feel so strongly about the other. But he knew one thing: Naira wasn't just here to find her sister. There was more at play than she was letting on. "Please," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "Ayeta is here because she was hurt."
"She needs time to heal. I'm not keeping her against her will."
Naira turned her piercing gaze to Thomas, her eyes cold as ice. "I don't care about your excuses, rancher. My sister doesn't belong here with you. She belongs with her people." Ayeta stood up then, stepping between the two of them. Her body was weak from her injuries, but there was a fire in her eyes that Thomas hadn't seen before. "Naira," she said, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "You don't understand. I'm not the same anymore. What's left for me back there?" Naira's face softened for a moment, but then she looked away. "You have to come back, Ayeta. Your people need you." Ayeta shook her head. "My people are gone. I'm alone." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Thomas didn't know what to say, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was clear that Ayeta's past was never going to leave her. The hurt in her voice spoke of years of pain and loss, and Thomas could see how much it tore her apart to think of returning to a life she no longer recognized. Nyara's gaze softened for a moment, and she took a step back. "I will not leave until you come with me, Ayita," she said quietly, her voice full of determination. "If you do not choose to come with me, I will take you by force." The words hung in the air like a threat. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the thought of Ayita being forced to leave, or the thought of Naira's warriors coming for her if she resisted. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Naira's eyes never left Ayita's, and Ayita's gaze never wavered from Naira's. There was no love lost between them, no sign of affection, only the cold reality of two women caught in a struggle neither of them could win. Alone. "I don't want to go back, Naira," Ayita said softly, her voice breaking. "I can't go back." Naira's face hardened again, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Then I will take what is mine." Thomas took a deep breath, realizing that things had just become far more complicated. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came, it was going to change everything. The tension in the cabin grew thick, like the storm clouds that had passed days before. Thomas stood between Ayita and Naira, trying to keep the fragile peace that had been carefully built since Ayita had arrived. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and both women stood still, their eyes locked, their thoughts swirling around a past neither of them seemed willing to let go. Ayita had not yet decided what to do. She glanced at Naira, then back at Thomas. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I cannot go back with you, Naira," she said, her tone quieter now. "I've lost too much. I can't just pick up and return as if nothing happened." Naira stood tall, unwavering, her arms crossed over her chest. Her gaze never left Ayita's face. "You don't understand," she said, her voice sharper now, but there was an edge of sadness in it. "You can never be truly free from what happened to your people. They are waiting for you. You have a duty." Thomas could feel the weight of their words. He wasn't part of their world, not in the way they were. He had his own history, his own burdens, but this was something else. The fierce pride in Naira's eyes was undeniable, and Ayita's pain was so raw, it was like a wound that had never fully healed. Naira took a step forward, but Ayita didn't flinch. "I've seen what you're capable of, Naira," Ayita said, her voice low but clear. "But what you can't see is that I have no place left with your people. What will I return to? What? A home that no longer exists? A tribe that's scattered?"
"I don't know if I can carry that anymore."
Thomas watched them, feeling like an intruder in their world, yet somehow bound to both of them. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He didn't want to get involved in a family dispute, and yet he couldn't stand to see Ayita in such pain. It wasn't his place to say, but something in his gut told him that this was far from over. Naira's presence wasn't just about Ayita anymore. It was about something deeper, something Thomas couldn't fully understand. "I will not leave without you, Ayita," Naira said, the words coming out with an authority that made Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened. She was serious. "If you refuse to come with me, I'll have no choice but to take you by force." The words hit like a slap. Thomas took a step forward, ready to intervene, but Ayita raised her hand, stopping him. She had been quiet for a while, letting the conversation unfold. Now her eyes softened, and she looked directly at Naira. "I'm not your prisoner, Naira," she said quietly but firmly. "You can't force me to return. I won't live that way. Not anymore." Naira's expression hardened, and for a moment it seemed like she might lash out. But then something in her demeanor changed. She stood silent, her gaze shifting to the floor as if the weight of Aita's words had finally settled into her mind. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice tinged with something like regret. "You don't get it, do you?" Naira asked, her tone softer but still filled with pain. "I'm not just your sister's keeper. You are my responsibility. You are always meant to be with us, and I can't bear the thought of losing you." Aita said nothing for a moment, her eyes cast downward, torn. "And I can't bear the thought of being dragged back into a life I've lost," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like out there. The raids, the hunger, the fear. It changed me, Naira. I'm not who I was." Naira stepped closer to her, her voice now full of desperation. "You think I don't know what it's like? You think I haven't felt the same loss?" Naira's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You think I've just been sitting by, waiting for you to come back to me? I'm here, Aita. I'm here because I can't do this alone. You don't have to face the world by yourself." The room grew quiet as the two women stood facing each other, the weight of their history hanging in the air between them. Thomas could see the struggle in Aita's eyes, the battle between loyalty to her sister and the reality of what had happened to her. He could see the pain in Naira's face, the unyielding love she had for Aita, a love that pushed her to try and bring her back, no matter the cost. But in that moment, Thomas realized something that he hadn't quite understood before. This wasn't just about a family dispute or an outsider caught in the middle. This was about two people, two women, fighting for their place in a world that had taken everything from them. "I didn't choose this life, Naira," Aita said, her voice breaking. "I didn't choose the violence, the loss. I didn't ask for it. But I have to live with it. I don't know if I can go back to a place that only brings pain." Naira stepped back, her eyes filled with frustration, but also a deep sorrow. "You've never asked to go back, but you can't move forward without facing what you've lost," she said quietly. "You can't run from your people, Aita. They need you." "I've been running for so long," Aita whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Thomas, standing just outside the circle of their tension, felt the weight of the words, of the silence that followed. He couldn't solve their problems, couldn't make the pain go away. But he knew that they both needed something that wasn't just about their people or their past. They needed peace, a chance to heal. For a moment, he just stood there, watching them, trying to find the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You both have your battles," Thomas said quietly, his gaze moving between the two women. "But you're not alone anymore." Neither of you. Aita and Naira both turned to him, surprise flickering across their faces. Thomas wasn't sure what he had expected them to say, but the silence that followed his words was a moment of clarity for him. He wasn't just a bystander in this story. He was a part of it now, whether he liked it or not. "You can both stay," Thomas continued, his words slow and deliberate. "This land is big enough for all of us, but no one's leaving here until we talk things through." The room was still, the tension now mingling with something else, a sense of possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas felt like he had taken a step forward, but he also knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. What came next he couldn't predict, but he knew it was going to change all of them. Naya looked at Thomas, then at Aita. Her eyes softened just a little. "I don't know how this will end, Rancher," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I'm not leaving until I know what she's going to do." Thomas nodded. "I understand." but neither of you will face it alone. And with that, the fragile peace that had begun to form between them took root, as they all realized that the path ahead would be harder than any of them could have imagined. But it was one they would have to walk together. The days after the standoff passed with a heavy silence hanging between Thomas, Aita, and Naira. They were all trying to find some sort of balance, but the tension was still there, like an unspoken wall. Each day brought a new challenge, and as time went on, Thomas realized just how complicated his life had become since Aita and Naira had entered it. He didn't know much about the Comanche or Apache ways, but he had learned that their lives were tangled in ways he couldn't untangle on his own. The tension didn't just fade away. It simmered under the surface as the three of them shared the same space. But despite the heavy atmosphere, there was an undeniable shift, a change in the way they began to look at one another. It wasn't friendship yet, but something was beginning to form. Trust was slow to build, but it started with little moments. A shared meal, a quiet glance, a few words that broke the silence. One morning, a new problem emerged, one neither Thomas nor the women had anticipated. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving quickly across the plains. Thomas had seen enough to know they weren't friendly. They were men with weapons. Dangerous men who didn't hesitate to take what they wanted. He could feel his heart race as he saw them draw nearer. They were heading straight for the ranch.
Who are they?
Aida asked, her voice filled with concern as she stood next to Thomas, watching the riders from the cabin's window. I don't know, Thomas replied, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. But they don't look like the kind of men who come asking for a cup of water. Naira, who had been standing quietly by the fire, suddenly moved with a grace and speed that caught Thomas off guard. She was already grabbing her bow and arrows, preparing herself for whatever was about to come. Her movements were confident, practiced. Aita, stay inside, she said sharply. Stay out of sight. These men won't stop for anything. Aida nodded, but didn't seem eager to be left behind. She had spent so much of her life fighting for survival, and the thought of hiding from danger didn't sit well with her. But she knew Naira's words were meant for her protection, so she stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, her heart pounding with both fear and a strange sense of anticipation. Thomas stood by the door, rifle in hand, waiting for the riders to get closer. He didn't know who they were, but he didn't trust them. He had fought for this land for too long to let anyone take it from him without a fight. When the riders reached the ranch, they didn't stop at the gate. They rode straight up to the cabin, their faces grim. Thomas stepped forward, aiming the rifle at the leader of the group. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but firm. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, gave him a cold smile. "We don't want trouble, cowboy," he said, his tone full of arrogance. "But we're looking for someone, a woman named Aita."
Apache. She's wanted for something.
"You wouldn't happen to know where she is, would you?" Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ha! You're on my land now. If you're looking for trouble, I'm happy to oblige." The leader's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "We don't want trouble, but we'll take what's ours." Now where is she? Just as the tension reached its peak, Naira appeared from behind the cabin, moving silently like a shadow. She stepped into the open, her bow already drawn and aimed at the leader. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't say anything. He knew there was nothing Naira couldn't do when it came to a fight. The riders stopped, surprised by her sudden appearance. "You won't take her," Naira said, her voice low and deadly. "You won't harm her."
You'd be wise to turn around and leave. For a moment, there was silence.
Then, The leader of the riders sneered. "You think you can stop us, woman? You and your little bow?" Naira's eyes never left the leader's face. "I don't need a bow to kill you," she said softly. The words sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. The leader took a step forward, but Thomas raised the rifle, his finger on the trigger. "I don't want to shoot you, but I will," he said, his voice unwavering. "Now turn around and leave. This is your last warning." For a long moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, the air crackling with the potential of violence. Then, as if sensing the danger, the leader held up his hand, signaling to his men. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning his horse and signaling for his riders to follow. They quickly rode away, disappearing into the distance. Thomas and Naira stood there for a long time, watching them leave. It was only when the sound of the hooves faded completely that Naira lowered her bow. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Are you all right?" he asked Aita, who had been watching from the window, her face pale with fear. Aita nodded, though her eyes were filled with a quiet, burning rage. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But those men, they'll be back. And next time they won't leave so easily." Naya turned to Thomas then, her eyes softer than they had been before. "You were right to be ready. They were looking for her, but it won't be the last time they come. These men work for someone else, someone powerful." Thomas nodded grimly. "I figured as much. The question is, what do we do now?" Naira didn't hesitate. "We prepare. They won't stop until they get what they want. But if we're ready for them, we stand a better chance." Over the next few days, the ranch became a place of constant motion. Naira and Aita worked together, gathering what they needed for defense, while Thomas began reinforcing the gates and checking the land for any sign of the riders' return. It wasn't just about surviving the next attack. They needed to be ready to fight, to stand their ground. Thomas was impressed by Naira's strength, her ability to take charge in a situation like this. Aita, too, showed a different side of herself, determined, focused, and ready to do whatever it took to protect herself and those she cared about. The bond between the three of them was slowly being forged in fire. Each day they became stronger together, relying on each other in ways that none of them had expected. It was more than just survival. It was a matter of trust. And in this wild land, trust was as valuable as gold. The days after the attack felt different for Thomas, Aita, and Naira. The sound of hooves in the distance, the rustling of wind through the trees, and the quiet crackling of the fire at night all seemed to carry a sense of something about to change. The world around them was still wild, untamed, and unpredictable. But for the first time, Thomas didn't feel alone in it. He felt a connection, an understanding with both Aita and Naira that had slowly built over time, piece by piece, despite their different histories and struggles. In the days following the raid, the trio worked together more closely than ever. They were learning how to live together, each bringing their own skills and knowledge to the table. Thomas had always been self-reliant, but he realized that survival out here wasn't just about tending to cattle or building fences. It was about people. And for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living in a way he had never expected. Aita was a constant presence now, no longer the silent, broken woman who had arrived in the storm. She had become strong again, her confidence returning slowly with every task she took on. Naira, ever the protector, watched over her like a hawk, but Thomas noticed the subtle softness that had started to show in her eyes when she looked at Aita. It was the same way Aita had begun to look at Naira, a connection forged through shared experiences, loss and survival. Thomas could feel it too, the shift. He had always been a solitary man, used to working alone. But he couldn't deny that the quiet bond between the three of them was changing him. It was in the small things, the way Nyara now joined him at the hearth at night, the way Aita smiled at him when she handed him a cup of coffee, the unspoken trust they all shared. But the question still lingered in Thomas's mind. What would happen next? He knew that the peace they had now wasn't permanent. The riders, the men looking for Aita, would come back, and when they did, things wouldn't be so easy. He had seen enough of the world to know that peace was fragile in these parts. But it wasn't just about the men who had come for Aita. It was about something bigger, the promise of a future, one that none of them could control. One morning, after a week of uneasy calm, Thomas sat outside the cabin, staring out over the land that stretched before him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the ranch. It had been a peaceful night, but Thomas knew that peace was always fleeting in the west. Nyara approached him quietly, her boots making little sound on the soft earth. She sat down beside him without a word, her gaze following his as they both looked out over the open land. There was no need for conversation. They had grown used to the silence between them, comfortable in the quiet understanding that passed between them. After a moment, Nyara spoke. "Aita is stronger now," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful, "but I still see the hurt in her eyes. She's not the same woman who left our tribe." Thomas nodded. He had noticed it too. Aita was different now, more confident, yes, but there was still something in her eyes, a shadow from the past that lingered just beneath the surface. "None of us are the same," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "We've all changed." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Thomas felt the weight of the world settle around them. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees in the distance, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. "You're right," Nyara said finally, her voice quieter now. "We can't go back to who we were, but we can choose who we become." Thomas glanced at her then, surprised by the depth in her words. Nyara was a woman of action, not one for talking about feelings. But in that moment, he saw something in her, something vulnerable, something real. "And what do you want to become?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Nyara turned to look at him then, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, finally, she said, "I want to keep my sister safe. I want to protect her. But I also want to protect this place." Her gaze turned to the ranch, the land she had only just come to understand. "I want to stay here, Thomas. I want to fight for something real." Thomas felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of surprise and something else, something that was hard to define. Nyara had always seemed like the warrior, the protector, the one who needed no one. But here now, she was saying something different. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a future. "I never asked for any of this," Thomas said quietly, his voice full of quiet wonder. "I never expected to be part of something bigger than myself. But here we are." Nyara nodded, her expression softening. "None of us asked for it. But sometimes life chooses for us, and sometimes we have to choose again." Thomas looked out over the land once more, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. What was it that he wanted? What was it that he could offer? He had always lived his life alone, his heart closed off to anything that threatened his peace. But now, with Nyara and Aita beside him, he felt a stirring, a desire to fight for something that wasn't just about him anymore. "I don't know what the future holds," Thomas said, his voice steady, "but I know this. I won't let you fight alone." Nyra's eyes softened. And for the first time since she had arrived, Thomas saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. "You mean that?" she asked, her voice almost vulnerable. Thomas met her gaze, his heart steady in his chest. "I do." As the sun rose higher, the three of them, Thomas, Naira, and Aita, found themselves standing at the crossroads of a new life. The past could never be erased, but it didn't have to define them. They could forge a future together, one built on the strength of their shared bond. Aita joined them, her steps quiet as she approached. She smiled at Thomas, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning.
For what? Thomas asked, surprised. For being here, Aita said simply.
For not turning away. Thomas felt something stir inside him at her words, something that made him realize how much he had changed, how much they all had changed. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They would protect each other, and they would fight for the future they had found in the heart of the wild. As the day stretched on, the three of them stood together, looking out over the land. It was theirs now, this place, this life, and together they would fight to keep it. The wild heart of the West had called to them, and now they had answered.